Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today I'm working on a 16" by 12" piece of St Cuthbert's Mill Bockingford watercolour paper, cold press, £140. Just to get the background in, I'm working wet on wet. I did cover the whole surface of the paper with a good quantity of water with a large brush. Applied just two colours, indigo and Mars brown, and now I'm just going in and mopping up some of the areas that I want to remain white-ish, sprinkling on some rock salt there, and then I go on and add some water droplets and leave the whole background to dry naturally so that the water droplets and the salt could do their thing, absorb pigment where they wanted to, very random. And yeah, it's just best to step away from your painting at this point, go and have a coffee, and just let the paper dry naturally. Okay, so it's now all dry. Going into the darker areas, I didn't remove any of the pigment that had sneaked into these areas. If I knew I was going in with a darker pigment on top, I just left it as it was. So just removing the pigment from the lighter areas of the subject. So going in with the same two colours again, indigo, Mars brown. And throughout the whole of this painting, I only used 4 colours in all. That's carmine, indigo, Mars brown and sepia. And later, just some Winsor Newton permanent white Designers Gouache, however you pronounce it. So yeah, just so working wet in wet. All the base coats in this painting were done wet in wet, just so I had a nice soft base coating to work the detail on top. So I pop the ears in first and then wet into wet again. So just wetting the area I just want to work in at this point. So when you're working wet into wet, the paint will flow to wherever there's water. So just wetting a tiny area, a specific area, and letting the paint flow to the edges. And they're called found edges. So when pigment hits an area where there's no water, where the paper is dry, that's called a found edge. If the paint was to move across the surface of the paper like it did in the background, because the whole background had been wetted, it eventually runs out of steam, it stops moving, and that would be called a lost edge. So found edges, lost edges, that's all it means. Excuse me if I keep coughing, just got over a virus. Great way to start the year. So going in with indigo, and just to take it a little bit darker in places, adding a little bit of the Mars brown to it. So to get my darkest darks in this piece, it was a mixture of the Mars brown and indigo, and then varying the quantities or ratio of the two colours depending on how dark I wanted to go. Getting that shoulder area in now, again working wet into wet, and just flicking the paint negatively up in towards the dry area where the white of the fur is going to be. I'm using a variety of different brushes today, and I'll pop them all in the description below. The one I'm using at the minute is a Faux Squirrel by Zen Art. I have the full set of those and they are brilliant. So vegan brushes, but they do hold an amazing quantity of water and pigment, and they come to a nice fine point. Getting some base coat into the paw area here, and going in darker on the left because I want it to look like the light's hitting it on the right. So forgetting about the little stick at the moment that the panda's holding, that can be put in later. I just wanted to get all the base coats in for the panda itself. And this is sped up quite a lot because the whole process took about 6 hours. I think I had about 6 hours of footage, and that doesn't include mixing paints and things like that. So it was quite a lengthy process for this project, and I've narrowed down the video to 45 minutes. So hopefully some of you are just sitting relaxing with a coffee, and hopefully some of you are doing some painting or crafting while this is playing in the background. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's been subscribing and commenting on my videos and liking my videos. It's really, really appreciated. And if you leave any questions, I do answer them all. So just working a little area at a time with water and allowing the pigments to flow from left to right. Now wetting the nose area, clean water, and then just popping the pigment in there. And again, just using the indigo and the Mars brown at this point. Keeping a limited palette really helps give a painting unity, like it all fits together, it all goes together. And there's less chance of creating mud if you're using a limited palette of transparent colours, which is the case in this painting. Just dropping in a little bit more pigment there. And when you're dropping in pigment to a painted area, that's called charging. You're just adding more pigment, which makes it look more intense. It intensifies the colour and also the depth. So I didn't use any black at all during the painting of this panda. Black on its own can look very flat, very dull. If you do choose to go in with black, make sure you're mixing it with a little bit of purple or a little bit of blue, just to give it a little bit more life. So not fussing with any details yet, just want to get all of the base coats in one go. This is where I started using the carmine, and I eventually mix it with a little bit of the sepia to tone it down. Always remember that your watercolours are going to dry 25% lighter than when you apply them, and just lifting out some of that pigment with a clean damp brush. Now going in with a tiny bit of sepia, and when the sepia, sorry, not the sepia, the indigo, and when the indigo, because it's blue, mixes with the pink, we get a purple tone. Tidying the edges there, just with a damp brush. And then building up the darks behind the teeth. The piece of paper that I'm resting my hand on is called Glazes, and it's an acid-free paper, and it doesn't pick up anything. You can rest your hand on it and it doesn't smudge or smear anything underneath it. Even if you're working in pastels, you can use a piece of Glazes to rest your hand on work you've already completed or you're halfway through, and it won't even smear pastel. So it's wonderful paper. That's Glazes. The one I use is by Clairefontaine, but I know there's plenty of brands out there. It used to be called butcher's paper. Now using the very fine tip on this big round brush and just getting some base coats along the lip line. So no detailing yet, just getting that base coat in my mind, just wanting to plant all of the base coats in, and it gives me a structure to work from going forward. Got a bit confused with my lines over on the left where the tooth is. I don't know why, I thought there were 2 teeth there in my mind, but there you go, you can see that I narrowed it down to just 1, which is correct. So with this area, working up the left hand side of the panda's face, I'd wetted the area and then I'd started applying sepia, a little bit of carmine and a touch of Mars brown, and just varying the different colours as I moved around the panda's head. I knew I was going to go on top of all of this and do the detailing with gouache, with the permanent white gouache, but I knew also that when I was using the permanent gouache I was going to be tinting it as well, so there's not a lot of just white paint on the finished painting. Once you apply your base coat layers like this, you can then go on and apply detail with white gouache, but you don't have to leave it white. As long as you've got a very light hand and a very soft brush, you can apply watercolour washes to the top of the gouache and it will just tint the white gouache to the colour that you want. It's called glazing. But just keep in mind that gouache remains reactive to water, so you will need to use a light hand when doing that process later on in your subject, or project, I should say. Again, keeping everything light. I don't want anything that's too dark along here. I'm thinking that the light is coming in from the right hand side. So I want the base coats to be slightly darker on the left than the right. Keeping everything soft, allowing the base coats of all the different colours just to blend seamlessly together. So there's no harsh start and stop points. And when applying these base coat layers, I'd like to keep in mind the direction of the fur that will be going on top, so that if I do happen to have any harder lines in the base coats, they won't look out of place because they'll be going in the correct direction in which the overlying fur will be laying. The direction will be the same. So taking that area a little bit darker, just a little bit of shadowing in the base coat layers there, just for a little bit more added effect. And this is all building depth for the finished piece. That's all dry now. You can dry the base coat layers off with a hairdryer or a heat tool. The background I did leave to dry naturally, but if you try to dry salt effects and things like that with a hairdryer, it doesn't give this salt time to absorb the pigment from the paper, and it just looks rushed. It just doesn't have the same effect. But with these base coat layers, if I need to work one area directly next to another, I need them to be dry, because if they're not, then they will bleed together and you'll lose definition from one area to another. So when I put the ears in and the eye patches in, they had to be dry before I could start applying base coats to the rest of the panda's face, else the black areas, or the darker pigmented areas, would bleed into the lighter coloured areas. If in doubt, just dry it with a hairdryer and then move on to the next stage. So the saying is, I'm sure you've heard it, about paintings having an ugly stage. Well, this is definitely the ugly stage. Yeah, but just keep in your mind what the finished painting, how you want it to look. You know, think of all that lovely detailing you're going to be able to put in later, and just concentrate on that and trust in your techniques trust in the process, and it will all work out in the end. This was just an experimental piece for a workshop I actually ran last Saturday, January 2025. I didn't know if this is the actual subject and style I was going to teach on that day, so this was a bit of an experiment just to see if I could achieve what I wanted to achieve in given time, and I was really pleased with the outcome. And the students on the day did such a good job. They really should be very proud of themselves. They did so well. Okay, so all base coats are now dry. So using a smaller round brush, this is a Rosemary Co number 6. I can't remember the series of the brushes, but I'll put the brush in the description. And just using a thicker mixture of the Mars Brown and Indigo, and just putting some detailing in now. So just directional hairs, no straight hairs, just making sure each one's got a slight curve to it, making sure they're going in the correct direction, and the hairs are not too short and not too long. And the idea of this isn't to cover all of the base coat that I've just applied, else there'd have been no point in putting a base coat down to begin with. This is just to give the area a feeling of texture. The watercolours I'm using are the Rosa Gallery watercolours, and I've had them quite a while now, a couple of years maybe, and I absolutely love them. They are such good paints. They're made by a Ukrainian company and they are amazing. You can buy them in sets, or you can buy them open stock, you know, just one colour at a time, or you know, you pick and choose which colours you want. The ones I have, I swatched out. I tested how transparent they are. They're all very transparent, and they all lift quite well, reasonably well. Some more than others, some are a little bit staining, but mostly they do lift really well. So I know going into this painting that if I go too dark in a certain area, I can, once the area's dry, I can use a clean, damp brush and lift pigment back off. It will never get you back to the white of the paper, but it will get you pretty close. So I'm just keeping an eye on my reference image, which is on my iPad in front of me, making sure that I'm keeping true to the direction of the hairs and the hair length. Sorry about that with the lighting, just getting in my own way there. But also I'm slightly altering the mix of the colour as well, so alternating between more Mars Brown, less Indigo, and vice versa, depending on how dark I want this mixture to be. Because there are going to be some areas on this eye patch, I don't know what else you'd call it, but where the light wouldn't be reaching as much, so there's going to be some shadowing, and in that area I can do a couple of things. I can crisscross these lines a little bit denser, and that'll make it look darker. Or I can alter my paint mixture and make the paint go darker too. So it's nice to use both of those techniques where I want the fur to be a little bit more dense and in shadow. Just building up the layers. I'd got the heater on in the studio now, so it was drying quite quickly, which was nice. I wasn't having to wait for areas to dry. And this is all working wet onto dry. So as you can see, still seeing a lot of that base coat layer poking through or showing through beneath the and in between the detailed areas, and keeping in mind that the paint I'm applying will dry slightly lighter. Obviously, if I didn't like the colour at the end of this segment of the painting, I could glaze different colours over the top if I needed to alter the hue, as long as the paint underneath was completely dry. Still using the round number 6 brush. I'm not one for using tiny brushes. I can't see the point. If you buy a good brush that retains a good point, that's all you need. So this is a quill brush. This is by Jackson's. I'll pop it in the description below. And this was ideal just for applying lots of detail strokes, and they hold lots and lots of water and pigment, so I did not have to keep dipping my brush in the paint to complete areas of this size. Again, keeping my eye on the reference image, making sure the strokes were going in the correct direction and that the strokes were the right length to correspond with the hair length in that area. If you hear any weird sounds, I've got my puppy asleep next to me and she does sometimes snore. So I've just paused the recording just for a minute because she was snoring like there was no tomorrow. So I thought we don't want that on the video. Sound effects. If you haven't given a quill brush a try, I thoroughly recommend them. These are vegan as well, but they're amazing. I think they're probably used by the Japanese and Chinese for their artworks with inks, but they're beautiful brushes to use, and they do retain the points really well. So because of the width of the barrel of the brush, it holds a lot of pigment, a lot of water, but the fine tip allows you to go in with detail too. So once I got the eye patches in and the ears in, it was time to get some detailed work done on the nose. So I'm back to using the Rosemary Co number 6 and just getting some detail in there. So just keeping my eye on my reference image. I got a vague line in for each nostril, but that's all. And again, still just using the indigo and Mars brown. Later in the painting process, I did add a little bit of a purple wash to the nose, and that was by using the carmine and the indigo, but predominantly the indigo with just a touch of the carmine to create a very deep purple colour. Making sure to keep the nostrils darker than the rest of the nose, just to give it that added sense of depth. And again, working wet into dry. Working wet onto dry, it just gives you a little bit more control over where your paint's going to move. And working in a small area like this, there's less chance of having a hard edge where you don't want it. Because if you see a hard edge forming where you don't want it, simply clean your brush off and then go in with a damp brush, and you can just agitate the pigment and remove the hard line that you don't want. Lift it out with a tissue. So making sure I do leave areas where the light will be hitting the nose, but also keeping in mind that where I want the lightest highlights, I'm going to be going in with the Winsor Newton Gouache later on. I can always pop in a little bit of highlight if it's not light enough, just with the watercolour. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. I hope you're enjoying watching this process. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share with family and friends if you think they'd be interested in seeing this process too. Also, if you're a member of an art group, please feel free to share my YouTube channel and videos with members of your art group. That'd be great. And as always, if you have any questions, please pop them in the comments below. Or if you're working on something and you're stuck, pop the question below and I will get back to you and see if I can help you as well. And also, if you've got any suggestions about future videos, what subjects you'd like me to cover, what mediums you'd like me to use, just let me know that too. So I do work in a variety of mediums, obviously watercolour, gouache, acrylics, coloured pencils, alcohol markers, sketchbooking and things like that, graphite, charcoal, a little bit of digital too. But anything you want to see, I'd be happy to create a video for you. It definitely stops art block when people make suggestions. It's lovely. So I dried it off with a hairdryer so I can go back into working wet onto dry. I'm thickening up the mixture, the paint mixture, so more pigment, less water, just so I can get the dark areas a little bit denser in colour. Now I'm working on the teeth and I'm going in with the sepia. So an initial wash of sepia. And what I do is dry the brush, and I've absorbed a little bit of the paint back off, just so it's not too dark. I've now mixed in a little bit of the carmine and Mars brown, just for the darkest areas at the bottom of the teeth, where it's in shadow. And tidying up around the edges there. A little bit more pigment going in. And then dampening the brush down again. Tiny bit of pigment, just so there's no harsh start and stop lines. And now clean damp brush, just to pull the highlights back down. So I just wanted to increase the shadow on the tongue. So just by mixing a little bit of the indigo and carmine again, just to create a purple colour, and then negatively painting up into where the lips are, just where the fur will be overhanging, just breaking up that line just a little bit to make it easier for me later on when I begin adding fur to that area. Now just getting the darks in around the lips, around the jowls, and I'll be softening this out later with a damp brush just so it's not such a harsh look about it. Again, just using the limited palette of colours makes life so much easier. I didn't actually pre-test these colours together before starting this project. It's just that I've worked with the Rosa Gallery watercolours for so long now, and these 4 colours have been sort of etched into my mind that I know that they work really well together. But if in doubt, do a little swatch card if you're planning on using just 3 or 4 colours, and make sure they all work well together and that you're not going to be making any muddy mixes. Generally, just mixing transparent colours, you've got less tendency of mixing mud. It's when you come to start mixing transparent colours with opaque colours or different opaque colours together that mud can occur. I mean, sometimes you want that neutral colour, that mud colour, but in this case I definitely didn't. So a very, very watery wash going over the tongue there. A very, very watery glaze, just to give it a little bit more colour. And then going in with a damp brush and just lifting some of that pigment back out and wiping it on a tissue. And there you can see how light it is once it's dried. So wetting this area now, just with clean water and a light hand, because I don't want to disturb any of that base coat. And then just dropping some pigment in. So these are the shadowed areas underneath the detailed areas that will be going on top, the detailing of the fur that will be going on top. Just letting it do its own thing, and because I'm working wet on wet, shouldn't have any harsh start and stop points. At the moment I'm using indigo and Mars brown again, mixed together, but more Mars brown than indigo this time. Just softening the edge along there, and softening that edge that was forming there just with a little bit of clean water. Going in with clean water again, just to put some directional markings in. It's just lifting the pigment off the paper and leaving me with a lighter version of the wash that I've just put on. Doing the same there. And all of this adds up to not having to do so much work in the final detailing layers with the gouache later on. Stumbling over my words. Clean water going onto the muzzle area now, the top of the nose, and applying a little bit of pigment, letting it do its thing. Just for that added depth that's going to be underneath the final fur detail. And again, softening the edges with a clean damp brush. The painting actually looks like it's breathing, it's moving up and down. But what had happened was I'd worked on this, and I hadn't gone over the whole piece with a hairdryer to heat it up so it would contract back and go flat. so there was a bit of a bounciness about the paper at this point. I was having too much fun to stop, when in reality really I should have stopped and taken the hairdryer to it and just, yeah, flattened it all out. But you just get in the zone, don't you, when you're painting, and the time goes whizzing by and you forget to eat and you don't want to stop and you don't want anything to disturb that moment. And I was having one of those moments now, just, yeah, in the zone. Listening to YouTube, I think, so, you know, random YouTube videos playing in the background. So finished with that area. What I've done now is I've taken a little bit of the Winsor Newton Designers Gouache and I've mixed a little bit of sepia with it. So you only need, if you want to dabble with gouache, you only need to buy a tube of white, pop it on a palette and then just mix a little bit of your watercolour colours with the white and you'll have all the colours you need, and it just gives you an idea of what gouache is like and how it works. And that's what I decided to do here. It really is a cheap way to find out if you're actually going to enjoy working with gouache, because just buying one tube is better than buying, you know, a whole set. But if you're going to buy a tube of white gouache, I do recommend buying a good quality one. And I've never gone wrong with the Winsor and Newton Designers Gouache. You can buy the permanent white or the zinc white. The zinc white for me is a little bit cold looking and I do prefer the permanent white. But again, just pop a little bit on a palette and then you can mix your watercolours into all different colour gouaches. Brilliant and cheap. Use what you have before you start jumping out and spending all your well-earned money on products you might not even get on with in the future. So try a little bit to begin with. So when applying gouache, make sure your underneath layers, oh sorry I'm off the screen there, but make sure your underneath layers are nice and dry. And remember that when you are working with gouache, when you go to work on top of a layer of gouache, make sure you've dried it, and it's always going to be reactive with water. If you're wondering what I'm doing just off screen there, I'm actually doing the same as what you've just seen me do the other side of the panda's mouth. There you go, back into view again. So that area is now dry. Now I've added more white to the mix, so less of the sepia watercolour colour and more white gouache into the mix, and just lightening that area on a second sweep. So another layer, keeping my eye on my reference image as I go, making sure I'm moving in the right direction, making sure that none of the hairs are straight, making sure they've all got a curve, and obviously again making sure that I'm not covering up all the work that I've done in the base coat layers. I still want that to be shining through. So direction, hair length, a little bit of curve on each hair, and making sure that the clusters of hair aren't too dense that you can't see the base coat colours. And then petering out as we go towards the lighter areas. So working with white gouache now, and there's a little bit of the carmine pink mixed in with this layer, and And I'll do as I did in the other area. I'll just work a couple of layers, altering the amount of colour to, well, altering the ratio of watercolour to white gouache as I need to. Again, letting the direction follow the reference image, making sure the hair lengths are correct. I mean, not exact, I'm not getting a tape measure out and measuring, but roughly the correct direction, the correct hair length, and leaving some of the base coat layers showing. And also hair width as well, because not all of the hairs on the face are going to be the same width either. It's going to have finer hairs in some areas and thicker, denser hairs in other areas. So if I want a finer line, I use the tip of the brush, and if I want a wider line, I just lean on the brush a little bit more pressure on the brush creates a wider brush stroke. This was such a fun project. I actually didn't want it to end. I really enjoyed creating this. Okay, now this brush is called a rake brush, so it's like a filbert, excuse me, but it's just got gaps between the bristles, and this brush is meant for acrylics, this particular soft grip brush. And I do go in there and just lay down a few trial strokes, I guess, but it is something that I use on and off during the process of this project. It can give you numerous lines at the same time, which is good, but the drawback is if you use it too much over too wide an area, they can end up looking like little soldiers because of the uniformity, whereas popping back to a normal round brush gives you the ability to vary the strokes, length, width, etc. So again, being careful not to cover up that dark shadowed area that I've put in. And less is more. So we don't need to put every single hair in, but we do need to convey the direction which the fur is moving in that part of the subject's face. And just letting some of the hairs overlap now onto the surface of the tongue, just to give it a little bit more realism. So as you can see, I've gone round the whole of the face with that technique, building up the layers. And now comes glazing. So when I want to glaze over gouache, I have got to keep in mind the gouache is reactive, so very light hand, very soft brush, so just using the tip of that number 6 and just applying the darks where I need to. Now if you go on too heavy-handed, what will happen is the gouache will reactivate and it'll start mixing with the paint you're applying, which is no good. It defeats the object then of having put it on all that work, and you'll just end up with a white hazy mixture on your paper. So just keep in mind, if you are glazing gouache, white gouache, just to keep a very light hand, and again keeping the strokes when applying gouache in the correct direction, so that if by any chance some errors do occur, then the lines will be going in the correct direction. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Sorry about my croaky coffee throat. There's the finished painting. He's 16 inches by 12 inches. I thoroughly enjoyed it. and I hope you did too. Take care everybody, and I will see you all soon. Bye for now.